So yeah, as Sophie said, my name is Tom Mcllroy, and I finished my PhD last year. And since then, I got a research job in industry in Melbourne. So that's why I had to Zoom in today. But still in the process of publishing my final paper from my PhD. So yeah, today I'm going to be presenting the work that I did on my PhD, and it's called Ask But You Might Not Receive: The Consequences of Unanswered Supervisor Support. So to give a quick introduction to what unanswered support is, you can think of it a little bit like being left on red in the workplace. So you might send an email or a message to your supervisor like this one asking for their help with something, but you don't receive a reply. And so there are two key elements in the unanswered support process. So it involves both the employee's request for support as well as the supervisor's subsequent failure to provide that support. And how this fits in with the broader literature. So the existing supervisor support literature is largely separated into two streams. So on the one hand, resource theories like the job demand control support model, job demand resources model, and self-determination theory, they tend to view employees more as passive recipients of support and don't really consider their own motivations to increase their own access to support. And on the other hand, theories on proactive behavior like job crafting, information seeking, and feedback seeking, they do consider employees as active agents trying to seek out support. But these theories neglect to consider whether or not the support is actually received. So this is where my research comes in. So I kind of integrate both of these different perspectives by considering both if the employee requests support in addition to whether or not they receive it. So in terms of the aims of the research, there were three main aims. So to understand the consequences, the process, and the boundary conditions of unanswered support. And we expected that unanswered support would have negative outcomes for employees' well-being, behavior, and relational outcomes. And in terms of the process, because unanswered support it focuses on employees' agency, we turn to motivational or agentic theories, particularly self-determination theory, to help understand why unanswered support might have negative consequences. And so we predicted that it would lower need satisfaction and increase need frustration, and ultimately result in these negative outcomes. And we also considered other factors in the work environment that might influence these outcomes. So specifically looked at whether employees' attributions for the unanswered support situation or their workload or their access to co-worker support might mitigate or exacerbate the consequences of unanswered support. So we looked at these as potential moderators. And so to address the aims of the research, I conducted a series of studies. The first one was a systematic review, and then I conducted a recall study and a work simulation study, which were incorporated in one paper. So I'll talk about those two together. And then I conducted a diary study, which is the one that I'm still trying to publish at the moment. So as I said, first I did a systematic review of the existing supervisor support literature. And I kind of, given my conceptualization of supervisor support, which considers both the requesting and receiving, I looked at all of the literature that looked at both of these elements. And broadly, it found that, not surprisingly, receiving support is a good thing for employees' well-being and their health. And also actively asking for support also has benefits for employees' well-being. But there were some gaps and limitations in this research. So as I alluded to at the start, the literature on the receipt of support is largely silent regarding employees' own agency in seeking out support, and the literature on requesting support is largely silent regarding whether or not they actually receive it. And there's also a tendency for the research to measure accumulated or kind of aggregate levels of support without considering specific instances where there might be a mismatch between the requesting and receiving of support. So basically, overall, there's an underlying assumption that requested support is always received and that received support is always wanted. And so based off of this, we proposed a supervisor support quadrants model, which considers both whether or not the support is requested in addition to whether or not it's received, which kind of results in these four quadrants. And in particular, today, I'll be focusing on this unanswered support quadrant, and no literature prior to my PhD, to my knowledge, had examined this quadrant. So I aim to explore this further. So I then conducted a recall study and a work simulation study. I'll briefly talk through the methods of both of these studies and then talk about the results together. So for the recall study, 280 employees were asked to recall a particular situation. So there were two conditions, unanswered and answered. In the unanswered condition, they were asked to recall a time when they asked for support and subsequently did not receive it. And then in the answered condition, they were asked to recall a time when they asked for support and received it. And then all participants completed a series of measures. So for the measures, we included indicators of well-being in blue, their behavioral outcomes, which are in gold there, their relational outcomes with their supervisor and the organization, which are in green, and we included need satisfaction as a mediator and attributions as a moderator. And in terms of the method for the work simulation study, so participants took on the role of an administrative assistant, and they had an email inbox, and basically they had to respond to the email inquiries and also book students into appointment times using this calendar. So this is the screen that they saw. And so I brought 267 undergrad students into the lab where they completed this work simulation. And while they were completing the tasks, a manipulation occurred where they were prompted to ask for support. So they received this message on the left here. Essentially, they were told that there was a new HR policy and to check whether or not their schedule complied. And if they were unsure, just to message their supervisor and ask them. And then this message window appeared where they could type their question to the supervisor. And then the supervisor's response varied depending on which condition participants were assigned to. So similar to the last study, there was an unanswered and answered condition. So in the unanswered condition, participants just didn't receive a response. The supervisor appeared offline. And in the answered condition, they received a supportive response. So they were told, good job, your appointment schedule complies, keep going. And then we also included two comparison conditions to help rule out alternative explanations. So we had an acknowledged condition where participants received a response, but it wasn't necessarily supportive. So they were told, I can't help you right now, but leave it with me. And then we had a control condition where participants weren't prompted to ask for support at all. They just continued with the manipulation. And then after the manipulation occurred, all conditions continued with the work simulation. And then again, they completed a series of measures. So similar to the previous study, we had indicators of well-being, performance, and relational outcomes. And again, looked at need satisfaction as a mediator and attributions as a moderator. And given the nature of the task, I was also able to get objective measures of how they did on the task. So for example, we could look at their performance quantity by looking at how many bookings they actually made, or performance quality in terms of how accurate they were in the bookings. So was the student and the advisor available at that particular time, as well as a few other behavioral measures as well. And the overall results for both studies largely supported the hypothesized mediation. So unanswered support broadly negatively affected employees' well-being, behavior, and relational outcomes via lower need satisfaction. But attributions didn't play out as expected, as they did not moderate the effects. And so the last study I'll talk about is the diary study, just to look at how unanswered support occurs in people's everyday working lives. So here, participants first completed a screening survey to make sure that they were eligible and available to participate. And then of those, 199 employees went on to complete daily surveys over 5 workdays. So they were just sent a survey at the end of each workday to complete. And because unanswered support is a novel construct, we had to develop a new measure. So we created some items in a pilot study, and an example item there is I did not receive feedback from my supervisor when I asked for it. So in addition to unanswered support, again, we measured emotional exhaustion, helping behavior, and perceived leadership effectiveness as the outcomes. Again, looked at need satisfaction as a mediator. And we also considered need frustration as a mediator. And we looked at coworker support and workload as potential moderators. In terms of the results for the diary study, so unanswered support, on days when employees experienced it, they had lower need satisfaction and higher need frustration. They also tended to be more emotionally exhausted, and they perceived their supervisor as a less effective leader. but the effect on helping behavior didn't come through there. And for the mediation analyses, we found that need frustration mediated the effects of unanswered support on emotional exhaustion. And again, we conducted the moderation analyses and did not find workload or co-worker support to moderate the indirect effects. So bringing all of the findings from the studies together, broadly, we found that unanswered support has negative consequences for employees' well-being, behavioural and relational outcomes. Although given the slightly mixed findings on the behavioural outcomes, this suggests that the effects may depend on other factors. So for example, it might be a certain aspect of behaviour that it impacts. So for example, it might only have an impact on performance quality, but not quantity. Or it may depend on the particular context. So it might have a stronger effect when employees are thinking back and reflecting on the situation rather than in the diary study, where it's more in the moment. So it might take a little bit longer to affect the behavioural outcomes. We also found that these consequences were driven by the process of lower need satisfaction and higher need frustration. However, in the diary study, when we looked at both need satisfaction and need frustration together, that study showed that need frustration may be the most important in explaining the effects. And overall, there was limited evidence for the boundary conditions of attributions, workload, and co-worker support. And so this lack of findings there suggests that the indirect effects of unanswered support might be fairly robust and not easily influenced by viable moderators. So an avenue for future research could be to explore other factors that might impact the effects of unanswered support. In terms of the implications of the findings, they highlight the importance of considering both the agency and the receipt of support, as I said at the beginning. So resource theories, while they focus on the receipt of support, they should also consider employees' own agency in seeking out support. So specifically, for example, self-determination theory, while it considers supervisor support is important for need satisfaction, which ultimately motivates them, it doesn't really consider employees' own motivation at the beginning to increase their own resources, so it should consider their motivation a priori. And again, on the other side, theories that look at requesting support should also take into consideration whether or not it's subsequently received, as this can also have implications for employees. And finally, in terms of practical implications, the findings have implications for employees, supervisors, and organizations. So in terms of employees, they could just meet with their supervisor and devise a plan. So what are they going to do if their supervisor is unable to provide support at a given time? But the findings suggest that receiving support from co-workers might not actually necessarily help. And that could be because maybe co-workers don't have the relevant knowledge to be able to help. And so that suggests that employees could find other avenues that they could turn to, for example, by accessing handbooks or other resources. For supervisors, of course, best case scenario, they would answer requests whenever possible, but there can also be practical constraints to this. So for example, if they've got a particularly heavy workload, they won't be able to help. And so they should ensure that employees have access to other resources if they're particularly busy. And they could also attend training or leadership development workshops so that they understand unanswered support and its consequences. And finally, for organizations, they could help by redesigning the work of supervisors to reduce their workload and limit the number of direct reports, just so that they have a greater capacity to support employees. They could also create self-managing teams so that employees have more autonomy and are less dependent on asking supervisors for support. Or they could potentially implement other initiatives to help satisfy their psychological needs. So because needs were a big driver of unanswered support, so for example, they could implement team building exercises to help offset the consequences as well. That's basically it. So thank you for listening, and a big thank you to my supervisors and collaborators as well, Stacey and Blake.
Do you have any questions from the audience? Any question?
Hey Tom, thanks a lot for really great to see the entire package. That's really great, and great to see also more generally. I just have one question, which is around the social support, the aspects of RED, or the way in which you think about this, or maybe even what what the data reveals around that. So is there any, maybe from the diary study, any other studies, do you have any insight, what kind of social support people are, thinking about? Is it more informational support or social support? And if so, what are the differential effects? Do you find, for instance, that, I would suspect that actually probably social support is, I don't know, but at least in the general literature, social support is really a key resource in workplaces. But which elements is it, now do you see differential patterns with maybe also differential needs now? Which of the needs, frustration of what kind of needs is particularly problematic, maybe versus other? Do you have any, insights or speculations on that?
Yeah. So in the recall study, actually, we got lots of qualitative data. We asked people to recall their experiences, and there were a variety of different types of support that they wanted help with. And there were kind of different types of unanswered support as well. So, for example, some were just completely ignored, whereas others were told that they couldn't help them, or some didn't have enough resources. So that was really interesting. I did want to look at the different types of support, but I'd already had a lot on my plate, so I didn't get a chance to look at that. But I think, that would be a good avenue for future research as well, to look at how different types of support might impact it as well. And I think that, again, maybe emotional support might not be as impacted, because perhaps co-workers are able to provide emotional support, so they might be able to get emotional support elsewhere. Whereas if it is kind of instrumental support that's pivotal to their role, they may be less likely to get that help elsewhere. So that might kind of impact the effects as well. And in terms of the specific needs, we kind of got a little bit of mixed findings for those as well. So in the first study, all three needs were strong drivers, whereas in the work simulation, it was mostly autonomy that came through. Which I thought that might have been due to the nature of the task. So it was, they weren't interacting with a real supervisor, so there wasn't that connection. So they might not have had relatedness in that sense. So it kind of makes sense that autonomy was the stronger predictor for that one. And for the diary study, relatedness and I can't remember which one. I think it was competence and relatedness came through strongly in the diary study. So there's obviously something there, and maybe future research again could look at the specific needs to try to unpack that a little bit more in terms of which situations impact which need as well.